Wonderful, great. Well, we'll get started here. Well, thank you all for joining us. It's been a while since our last Thursday webinar, and so great to have you all back. We're very excited for this particular webinar today to get insight from people who have been through significant recycling changes and program implementation. So really the focus or the theme today is what's gone on in these areas who have implemented major recycling policy and lessons learned. So with us today, we have a really great wealth of information. We're going to start off with Eric Randall. Eric Randall is the Director of Recycling for Bryson Recycling based in Northern Ireland. Eric is a serial social entrepreneur, started his career in recycling in 1989 with cooperative Bradford Waste Chasers. Since 1992, Eric led the development of social enterprise, Bryson Recycling, which is now the leading provider of household recycling services in Northern Ireland. The company employs over 350 staff across Northern Ireland, Donegal, and Wales. They collect and process recyclables from 50% of Northern Ireland homes, deliver collection services for garden waste, commingled recycling, and residual waste, operates a MRF, manages 8 household recycling centers, and runs a reuse shop. Just a couple of things. Bryson has driven improvements to containers and vehicles used for curbside recycling that we'll hear Eric chat about today. And that's been identified by the governments across the UK as the best value and environmental approach. After Eric, Andy Reese is back. You may remember Andy from some of our previous webinars. Andy is the head of waste strategy for the Welsh government. He has a demonstrated history in working in the government administrative industry, skilled in circular economy, resource efficiency, waste, sustainable development, corporate social responsibility, government and water quality. He has a strong business development professional with a PhD focused in marine geochemistry from Swansea University. After Andy, we'll hear from Deborah Sachs. Deborah is the Department of International Trade Specialist for Waste and Resources there in the UK. She has over 20 years experience in the waste management industry, working with local and central government and businesses in identifying requirements for new facilities. She has a profound understanding of the policy and commercial requirements of sustainable waste management and has good contacts within the industry throughout the world to develop new systems in both waste management and energy generation. She specializes in advising on foreign direct investment in the waste and resource management sectors, analyzing the UK market in waste and materials management, and identifying opportunities for new investment. She also works with UK companies in this sector to introduce some of the opportunities in new markets for those companies to export. And then bringing up our fourth is another returnee to our webinar series, Bernard Fenner, who is the VP of Energy Services for True North Renewable Energy. As part of True North Renewable Energy, his charge is to develop and grow organics to energy businesses and assist other True North entities in developing market entry strategies. Prior to joining True North Renewable Energy, Bernard was Senior VP at Harvest Energy, responsible for global sales and development of organics to our energy business. And then prior to that, Bernard spent more than 8 years heading up the CompoGas anaerobic digestion business based there out of Zurich and developing AD throughout Europe. So we have a lot to cover today. We're very excited, and so we're going to jump on in. Please feel free to ask any questions of our panelists. We welcome the dialogue. Please ask all questions through the Q&A function, and then we will have some time for Q&A at the end to address it, and then our panelists will also be jumping in as needed. So don't be shy to ask any questions of the panelists here. So with that, I'll turn it over to Eric, and thanks so much. Glad to have you all here.
Thanks very much. And appreciate the introduction. And I'm just, there we are. Is that all sharing?
Yep.
Good. Okay, so look, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you about food waste collections in Northern Ireland. I've already been well introduced, but just to say, Bryson is, it's a slightly unusual organization in the space of being a waste contractor, effectively, in that we're a social enterprise. Unfortunately, a bit of a dying, the last of a dying breed in the UK. There were an awful lot of us for quite a while, but glad to say that we're still here and thriving. We're owned by a charity, which actually employs around 1,000 people in total, and carries out a number of activities such as care, training, work on the multicultural scene as well, and energy as well. I think what makes it an interesting place for me to work is that we start off by asking the question, how do we derive the best social and environmental benefit from the problem of waste? And we build our business model around that. So that's geographically where we are situated. And this is the long list of things that was read out earlier, so I'm going to just jump across this pretty quickly. Yeah, so we do have experience of operating a MRF. I was just looking at these pictures, and the bottom right-hand one really dates the photograph back to about 2006. We don't get newspaper like that anymore. It's all gone digital, and that's a very different mix of material coming down that particular line. So the core of what we do, as well as operating the MRF, is this is our 20th year of collecting material from the Kerbside. And I put these pictures in because they were taken 20 years ago, and it was a trial using electric vehicles. It doesn't look like this anymore, but interestingly, the vehicles that we have operating here, and I'll talk about the collection system in more detail in a little bit. But interestingly, the first version of these vehicles now, fully electric version of these vehicles, is going to be arriving in Wales. I think there should be 7 by the end of the financial year. So I think it's important to start off by just explaining the background to which we're operating in Northern Ireland, because obviously it's going to be very different from the States and California. So in the UK, councils are legally required to collect household waste. It's paid through local taxation, the council tax, which I think is similar to what happens in California from our pre-chat. They are free to all, although garden waste, which is collected, is sometimes charged for as well. The services are either provided directly by councils or contracted to waste management companies, such as ourselves. There's no option to charge by weight for waste, which is a common practice elsewhere in Europe. But because it has to be provided free, there's no pay by weight option. And most recycling collections, and actually garden and food waste collections across the UK as a whole, are commingled. And by that I mean garden waste is very frequently commingled with food waste, and dry recyclables are commingled together. My next slide, I'm going to talk a wee bit about the regulatory background. I've kind of selected some regulatory highlights that I think have a major impact on the direction. But before I do that, one of the key ones, and an interesting one, is the fact that there's an economic driver. We have a landfill tax, which is equivalent to $133 per ton of material if it's sent to landfill, and that's before you even have the cost of landfilling added to that. So that becomes a huge driver, because the cost of landfilling is higher than the cost of treatment for organics. And my own view is that having the twin approach of regulatory requirement plus an economic driver, which is the kind of the hard reality of world, kind of helps to drive real change. Okay, I'm not a regulations expert, but this is as I understand it. And I'm looking at Andy because I think he'll correct me if I've made any mistakes. So we have a long-standing requirement to reduce biodegradable municipal waste, which includes food waste, any other organics waste, and including anything else that biodegrades, so paper and cardboard would be in that, to 35%, less than 35% of 1995 levels by 2020. And that is, that material has to be treated, so it could be recycled, composted, or sent to energy from waste. We have a very active regulatory framework at the moment, rapidly changing, with some of the biggest, well, the biggest changes in 20 years easily at the moment. We have a target of a 65% recycling and composting rate by 2035. That's driven by Europe. Extended producer responsibility is another massive change that's coming into play, where the local councils will no longer be responsible for the cost of recycling packaging. That will be paid for by brands who produce packaging. And the power balance and the shift in approach, it's a huge change. To help us get there, there are other pieces of legislation going on, including collections consistency regulations, which require councils to shift towards a more consistent approach to recycling from households. And at the same time, there's as a lot of the cost is going to be covered by brands, there's a shift towards a requirement to councils to provide free garden waste collections, and also provide weekly separate food collections. By that I mean separate from garden waste. Now this has just been in a consultation process, which is two of the consultations involved have closed, and the other ones are about to close certainly, I think, within the next few days. Okay, so the model that that Bryson operates is as shown here, and this is identical to the Welsh model, which Andy will be talking about as well. So it's driven by a restriction on the collection of residual waste. So traditionally we would have had a 240 litre fortnightly collection of residual waste for disposal, and that's now reduced to 180 litre fortnightly collection, along with an interesting approach to recycling, and I'll explain a little bit more about this. You'll see that recycling receptacle in the middle there, which you will not have seen the like of before, unless you've been following the story in Wales and Northern Ireland. And then food waste, which is integrated into that collection, and I'll explain how that works. And then a fortnightly collection of garden waste. So, there's a big discussion, and I'm sure it'll be happening in California, about how's the best way to actually collect garden waste and food waste. Well, food waste is what you're required to collect. So the approach that we carry out really does, as I said, it integrates both the dry recycling along with food collections, and it's a multi-stream recycling collection system as well. So if you're interested in this approach, you kind of need to be interested in the whole thing. But the way it works is that householders get starch liners for food. The food goes into the small brown caddy, and then once full, goes into the larger caddy, which is then set out and collected. I have a short video which just shows you how that works in a second. It means that the collection costs are definitely higher than mixing them into garden waste, but the fact that it's weekly and there's less of a yuck factor from the householders around bin residue and smells, we tend to get more compost actually put out that way, more food waste, And we expect about a 30% higher level of food waste capture through this approach, which then of course it means lower landfill costs and, as I've explained earlier, lower landfill tax costs with that as well. We also think that there are process cost savings, that the garden waste can be windrowed, which is more cheap, and the food waste goes straight for anaerobic digestion. It also means that there can be seasonal changes as well to garden waste collections, and that they could potentially be dropped for us over the winter period when there's a lot less garden waste being produced. So overall, while it's more expensive to collect, we think doing it weekly like this is better, particularly as we can integrate it into the dry recycling collection. So this vehicle then has different compartments for different materials. The one in the middle, the arrow clearly pointing to a food waste compartment. Food waste could be 45% of the weight of what we actually collect on our rounds, but because it's so dense, it's actually fits into a relatively small compartment. And this is a quick video just showing you that actually being operated on the street. And back at the depot, that compartment is removed and then actually tipped straight into a roll-on, roll-off skip. So it's very efficient, keeps stuff off the ground. And we are sending one full skip of that away every day from the 50,000 households we collect from in Belfast. Okay, so I want to quickly touch on then the dry recycling element of this while I'm here, because I think it's also relevant. This is the container I mentioned. You can see we keep fibers together on the top box. The middle box, which has a red flap to enable people to put the items in, is for drinks containers largely, along with foil and aerosols. And the bottom one is for glass. So we keep glass and fibers completely separate. We do very little sorting of this. We kind of train the households to do it right. And that works like this with the vehicle. You can see the containers going to that small compartment on the right-hand side. They are by far the highest volume. And actually there's a lift inside there, which means that they fill the top deck completely of where you can see Bryson Recycling and Recycle from Home with the plastic bottles, pots, tubs, trays, and cans. Paper in the next section, glass second to the back, and cardboard at the very end. And just very briefly, this is kind of how it works. This guy's magic, he goes into slow motion partway through. We're bringing back the vehicle. The ram then pushes the plastic bottles and so on out. And that's less than half a day's worth of material collected, all good quality material. And this is why we do it, because to derive the best economic and environmental benefit, we want to see that these materials are collected to a high standard. There's no high MRF costs involved in this at all. And 86% of what we collect is actually reprocessed directly in Northern Ireland, and it's worth over £100 million in added value to the Northern Irish economy. So by collecting food waste at the same time, overall, we have the most efficient system. I have modeled this in very many ways, and it's really clear to me that this approach is at least 20% less costly than a single stream with food waste collected, commingled with garden waste. So we're offering not only the least expensive, but actually we get higher rates, 20% higher in terms of the amount of material we collect overall. And garden waste is about, food waste is about 30% higher than if you collect it mixed with garden waste. So that's me, hopefully well within my 10 minutes. And it's a whistle-stop tour of the way we look at collecting dry recyclables and food waste at the same time in Northern Ireland.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eric. Yeah, always so interesting to hear about your programs there and the sorting with not just the wheelie bin, but your trucks as well. So very exciting. So next up, keep this moving along. We will turn it over to Andy Reese. Andy is a returnee to our webinar series. We're always happy to have him. And Andy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. So it's good evening from me and good morning to you. And fingers crossed I can get the technology to work. So just bear with me. Okay, so you've probably got the presenter's view now, haven't you? So I'll just swap it over. So is that okay? Yep. Is that working okay?
Yes.
Yep. Good.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. Right. Thank you to Eric for giving quite a lot of the operational details. I'll give a bit more of a strategic overview. I've got a silly number of slides, about 20, but luckily now I can skip through quite a few of them because some of them duplicate what Eric has said. So I'll do my best to keep to my 10 minutes. Just to remind everyone where Wales is, we're on the western side of the UK, as highlighted in the red box there. Interestingly, that slide from Waste Company Sewers shows the recycling rate in each local authority across the UK. And the darker the green, the higher the recycling rate, and the darker the red, the lower recycling rate. So as you can see, Wales is doing pretty well, and we've got a high recycling rate across all of our local authorities. The Welsh Government was created in 1999 on devolution. We have 22 local authorities. We have our own parliament and government, and we have a lot of powers in relation to economy, education, housing, etc. And of course on environment and waste. So we have the ability to set our own primary and secondary legislation on waste, which we have done to reasonable effect over the years. And we also now have responsibility for the landfill disposals tax in 2018, but at the moment we've kept the same rate as in the rest of the UK. We've had a sustainable development duty since our inception back in 1999, but that was then strengthened with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which requires the Welsh Government to deliver sustainable development and all our public sector bodies. And we have 7 wellbeing goals where we have to maximise our contribution towards each of the goals, and all our public sector bodies have to do that. All the goals are equal, of course, but I highlight a prosperous Wales, where we need to have a low carbon society which uses resources efficiently. So that is a good hook for us in terms of our circular economy and resource efficiency division. We of course left the EU and are now ploughing our own furrow. But of course, we still have to comply with international obligations, not least the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. Again, all those goals are equal, but highlighting Goal 12 on sustainable consumption and production, which of course resource efficiency and circular economy and waste can all contribute into. We've had various waste strategies over the years. I've been involved in this job for 21 years. Our first waste strategy was in 2002. Then 2010, where we set various ambitious targets, such as 70% recycling by 2025. And a key part of that would be separate food waste collection and anaerobic digestion. Various other targets there, which I won't labour on because of time, but we've recently published a new circular economy strategy beyond recycling, which retains those original targets, but also looks towards zero waste by 2050. And 100% recycling effectively. So we'll be looking to set new recycling targets for after 2025, and we're currently working on that. So our goal is to transition to a more circular economy where we keep resources in use and avoid waste where possible, and moving to that one planet resource use goal. We have a food waste focus, as I said. Obviously, applying the waste hierarchy, we need to prevent food waste, first of all, through reducing process waste, valorization of valuable side products, byproducts, etc. But also importantly, redistribution of surplus food from our retail sector and its supply chain. So we funded for a number of years the charity Fair Share, who takes surplus food from the retailers and the supply chain and supplies it to those in food poverty who struggle to be able to get a meal every day. And many millions of meals have been provided from food that would otherwise have gone to waste. Like Northern Ireland and like what Eric has said earlier, We want the food waste which cannot be prevented or prepared for reuse to be collected separately and treated to AD, by AD using a quality protocol compliant digestate. And I highlight that on the right, PAS 110, the quality protocol for digestate that we require all of our anaerobic digestion plants to meet, so which gives confidence to the use of digestate as a valuable fertilizer and soil enhancer. In terms of our policy measures in Wales for food waste recycling, we put in place the Waste Wales Measure 2010, which sets statutory recycling targets for local authorities. I'm fairly sure we're the only administration out of the 4 in the UK to set statutory targets, and I think we're one of the few administrations in the whole of Europe that actually set statutory recycling targets. Eric mentioned earlier the landfill directive targets to reduce biodegradable municipal waste. We set landfill allowances scheme regulations in Wales with fines to our local authorities of £400 per tonne if they failed to divert enough biodegradable municipal waste away from landfill. And then as well as a stick, we have applied a huge carrot. From around 2008 onwards, we gave our local authorities £23 million extra funding for the collection of food waste. So we have around 3 million population and around 1.3 households. So hopefully you'll be able to equate that. Apologies, I haven't converted that to dollars. So from around 2010, 2011, we had 99% of our households, wherever they may be, in remote countrysides, in the middle of our cities, or in suburban areas, all have a separate weekly food waste collection system. Alongside all of this, we've had a number of waste awareness campaigns all the way back to 2002, TV adverts, etc. And I'll give you an example a bit later. And I'll also mention the procurement support we've given to our local authorities to develop anaerobic digestion solutions for the food waste that they've collected. I think Eric has pretty much covered this. We've adopted exactly the same methodology with kitchen caddies provided to everyone, free liners, importantly restricting residual waste collections. Everyone used to have a weekly black bag collection. Now at best they have it every 2 weeks. In some of our authorities it's once every 3 weeks, once every 4 weeks. And also most of our authorities have provided smaller bins or restricted the number of bags. That really encourages or forces people not to put their recyclates or food waste into those bins because they get full too quickly. So they really have to use the weekly, very convenient recycling and food waste collection service. A number of authorities have put stickers on residual bins to say no food waste, please, which kind of gives the impression to people that it's you know, an illegal thing to put food waste in the bin, although it can be in some authorities if they've gone down that route. But anyway, that has actually nudged people into doing the right thing. Our authorities have done extensive communication campaigns, and indeed in some places knocking on people's doors if they haven't if they don't regularly put food waste out. Just some typical example of communications to householders. Obviously, really key to encourage people and to explain what happens to their food waste and why it's a good thing to do and where they can get advice. So that side of things is really important. Again, Eric has pretty much covered this. We use the same type of resource recovery vehicles, as they're called, and they can serve all sorts of different housing types. And there are small vehicles that will go down through the back alleyways to collect the food waste and recyclables down the lanes at the back of a property, which can sometimes be a bit, well, can be very restricting for large vehicles. Just to show where we've been, as I said, I started in this job in 2000 when we were on about 7 or 8% recycling. We're now on 65% recycling. The blue and green dots there are our progress. We had a little bit of a hiatus a couple of years ago where we were critically looking at the wood waste that was reported, and there were some errors there by our local authorities, but now we're back on an upward trend again. And that just highlights the various initiatives, waste strategies and things that we've done to get to where we are now. We're very proud that we are third in the world as a nation in terms of our recycling rate, and that's a normalized recycling rate, which is why it's a bit lower, sort of taking out sort of some of the extra things that we count towards recycling and which other countries count towards recycling. So this is trying to compare apples with apples. So we're pretty proud of that, but we're quite keen to get to number 1 So we are doing more on all of this. This one shows the percentage of households with food waste collections, comparing ourselves against the other 3 UK nations. The next one below us is Northern Ireland, which I'm pleased to say is very much catching up and maybe getting to our 99% level before long. Below there, the table below highlights that in Wales we have 100% collection of food waste on its own, not collected with garden waste. And it's a different picture in other parts of the UK. Eric mentioned the landfill directive, diverting biodegradable municipal waste from landfill. Here are the figures from 2010 to 2019, I think it is, or 2018, with a black graph on here, showing that we're reducing more biodegradable waste than the other 3 nations. So again, we're quite pleased with that. And that is through our focus on food waste collection and going to aerobic digestion, as well, of course, as recycling paper and card and textiles and garden waste. I've mentioned the municipal food waste treatment programme. Due to time constraints, I won't labour it, but we worked with 17 of our local authorities, organised them into 7 hubs, and then supported them with procurement. And we've ended up with 7 contracts and 5 anaerobic digestion facilities distributed geographically throughout Wales, with 141,000 tonnes at the moment food waste going to them and 7 megawatts of renewable electricity produced. If you want more detail on that, I'd need to refer you to my colleague who led that programme, but I'm happy to do that. Let's not forget carbon. We have a huge challenge to meet our net zero carbon target for 2050. Waste has an important role. The waste sector has an important role there. We've made a 63% reduction so far, mostly by diverting biodegradable municipal waste away from landfill. Of course, methane is a very potent landfill gas, very potent greenhouse gas. So that's where we are in terms of that black triangle, and we need to get down to eventually to 0 emissions from waste, and certainly 0 emissions from landfill. Have we got everything out of the residual household bin? Hell no, there's a lot more to do. 50% of our residual waste is composed of, half of it is food waste and half of it is easily dry recyclable waste. So despite our pretty good recycling record, we can still go a lot further. Again, with industrial and commercial waste, we looked at the residual fraction, and the most common component there is food waste, highlighted at the top. So there's a lot more we need to do there. And we are going to do that with new regulations to require all non-domestic premises to separate out their recyclables and their food waste for it to be collected separately, and also introduce a ban on the disposal of food waste to sewer. That is our recycling bins in our office in Cardiff, which I would have been going to if we hadn't had COVID and working from home, but just to show that we are practicing what we preach there. Then finally, we have got our Be Mighty campaign, which you just heard won an award yesterday or the day before, a £1 million TV advertising campaign last year, and we hope to extend it this year, really in terms of behavioural insights, making people proud of how we're doing, and wanting to go further and get to #1. And this is just an example of some of the images that have been used in TV adverts on the side of vehicles and wherever possible to promote food waste recycling. So thank you for that. I look forward to questions, and I hope that was of some use for you. So hopefully I can work out how to stop sharing and everything will be fine. Yeah. So thank you very much for listening.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Andy. A lot of good information. All right, I'll turn over to Deborah.
Hi, so can you see my screen is the question?
Yes.
So Andy and Eric and I did have a little bit of gossiping beforehand, but not sufficient to prevent all overlap in our presentation. So I apologise for that in advance. And also declare my interest as actually a director of Bryson Recycling. So it might seem a little bit incestuous, but in fact the truth is that the model that Eric has developed in Northern Ireland and that is being rolled out in Wales is objectively the correct way of achieving the highest recycling rate. in my opinion, as a consultant working in this area. So that's why I'm trying to support Eric in his work. And I figured that he and Andy were going to talk about collection. So I was going to just talk about treatment a little bit and look at the sort of different options. And Bernard will obviously talk about anaerobic digestion in a lot of detail. So I just thought I'd spend a little bit of time talking about all the other sorts of options, which I guess are already actively engaging in California. Open window composting for garden waste, in-vessel composting, which is a kind of compromise between the two. So you have your organic waste inside some sort of container and but you're not actually capturing the methane. Home composting hasn't been mentioned, and there was historically quite a big campaign for that in the UK, although perhaps some mixed results. And then I'll just sort of touch on energy from waste and landfill. AD is a fantastic technology, and I would certainly support it if you can possibly deliver it. And I'll talk a little bit about the incentives that we have certainly in the UK for AD, but there are some difficulties, one of which we struggle with a bit in the UK is the management of digestate, which is produced in a sort of seasonal basis, can be high in ammonia, possibly needs additional composting after the AD process. Our air quality people in the Environment Ministry have keep raising issues about the use of digestate on land. So it just needs a bit of careful handling, can be very wet in the autumn. The other issues around AD really are the sort of high capital expenditure. You need a fairly fancy kit, and you need some competent people to run it. And I think sometimes that's underestimated. You need to know what you're doing to manage the process properly. And you need to try not to lose all your teaspoons in the food waste, as well as having contamination levels from plastic and crockery and what have you. So you do need a little bit of pre-treatment, and I guess the thing to do is just not underestimate that. But it's a fantastic technology, which Bernard will talk about it a little bit before. Open window, really useful for garden waste, and I think Andy's described how food waste and garden waste or yard waste is usually collected separately in Wales, and throughout the UK it's collected in a variety of different ways, but certainly if you put garden waste into anaerobic digestion facilities, you're paying a lot of money for treating something that's fairly basic. And so that's one of the main reasons we try and keep it separate. It's just much cheaper to collect it separately, tends not to be contaminated, tends not to have too much in the way of plastics in it, and you can just treat it from the outside. In the UK, we have very strict laws on the management of food waste. As a consequence of the BSE epidemic we had some years back, when nasty prions got into the food chain, particularly into meat. And so if you're handling meat and cooked food in the UK, you have to be very careful, and you're not allowed to leave it in the open air. It has to remain under cover, and you need a tight management system, like Eric described, to handle it. So you can't have an open window composting for food waste. So that's the reason we tend to separate it all out in the UK. And open windows are just much cheaper for yard waste. Again, it's a little bit about in-vessel composting. The last survey I saw, the cost of treating waste through in-vessel composting is actually a little bit more expensive than anaerobic digestion, but I think it's because the incentives you get for biogas aren't included. So the advantages are you've got decent odor management, and it composts the material relatively quickly, and it's quite compact in terms of the amount of land it takes up. So it does have a place, I think, in the sort of selection of treatments. And I just mentioned home composting again. I think if you've got the space at home, it's a really important element, partly for garden waste and partly for raw food waste. And there used to be a whole program of encouraging households to compost at home. They used to give away these sort of little Dalek-like things, although they're a bit small, but it is magic. I mean, it makes compost and the material disappears and you can use your compost later for your garden. So I would definitely build that into your communications campaign and your implementation campaign. And I always like to put in a slide about sort of intermediate treatment, the baling and transfer stations, because if you get that intermediate treatment right, your transfer stations and your baling, you can really get some value out of material. And keeping it clean and separate, keep food out of the paper will keep its value up. So having the right kit and the right waste transfer stations, I think, are really important. Both Andy and Eric have talked about the landfill tax, but I'm just going to mention that the history of this, which is that when the landfill tax was initially introduced in the UK, it was 1996. And it was as a result of the European Waste Framework Directive, which started to try and constrain the amount of biodegradable waste that was sent to landfill as a climate change measure. And it was the UK's idea to introduce a landfill tax, and it started off at £2 a tonne. So that's what, a couple of dollars. And that wasn't too bad, but there was this escalator, and so it went up and up and up and up. And then now it only goes up by inflation, but we are at a spectacular $133+ per tonne. And on top of that, if you're sending biodegradable waste to a landfill site, you have to pay the gate fee, which is typically £40 a tonne, plus your haulage costs. So that means there's money in the system in the UK. You can spend all that on doing something else with it. Eric and Andy have talked about the landfill allowances, what have you, and perhaps just to say, if waste going to landfill is not biodegradable, if it's not conventional non-hazardous waste, but it's inert waste, the landfill tax is much, much lower, currently about £3.10. And the eagle-eyed amongst you will spot that there is therefore a huge incentive to mislabel your waste, should you be able to, as inert, if you possibly can. And so there's just a bit of a waste crime industry in mislabeling waste, if you can possibly get away with it. And that points to the really important role of the enforcement agencies. So we have regulators and local authorities in the UK whose job it is to enforce the regulations, enforce the rules, and take people to court if they break the rules. And without a strong regulator, the whole system just doesn't work. I just want to talk a little bit about data, because Andy and Eric both produced some really good numbers. And I would emphasize how important it is to understand what waste is being produced, what waste is being collected, how much of it there is, how much of what it is, doing some real waste composition studies, and then understanding where it goes. And that system in the UK is pretty sophisticated for waste that's handled by local authorities. They weigh everything, all their contractors weigh everything and know what sort of material it is, and then they upload that information and it's all collated centrally. Waste from businesses is not collated centrally in the same way. And so we don't really have such a good grip on how much waste there is from businesses. Various studies are done, and Wales have done a lot of surveys and studies over the years to try and understand how much waste comes from businesses. But there's a lot of work going on to try and improve that. And there's a link there in the slide to a project that's going to try and give us better data. Once you know what the material is, you can hone in on it and capture it much more effectively. And then just a slide about the incentives for renewable energy from waste. Now, this only happens if you manage to capture it for value. If you make electricity from either incineration or anaerobic digestion, you can apply for subsidies. The current subsidy regime for renewable energy in the UK is called the Contract for Difference, which is a sort of auction where you bid for the amount of money you will sell renewable energy into the grid for. And then the government pays you that amount, no matter what the actual price is. So if the actual electricity price is that strange wiggly blue line, you're insulated from that change in price. You just get the £60 per megawatt hour or whatever it was you bid. And the government absorbs the difference and makes a payment into the system. So that means you can invest. That means you know what your bid price is, you know what you're going to get for your power, you know how much power you're making, and you can invest. And that's in fact how the offshore wind industry has established itself in the UK and brought its costs crashing down. Doesn't work so well for the waste management industry, but it's quite an interesting approach to incentives for renewable power. For renewable heat, we used to have something called the Renewable Heat Incentive, which is now being replaced by something called the Green Gas Support Scheme, which is coming in later on this year. And that's to support biomethane being injected either into the grid or to make heat. If you inject biogas into the gas grid in the UK, then you need to make sure it's of sufficient quality. It's got to be basically 99% pure. And you have to put a smell into it so that people know that it's gas. And it has to be from waste in order to receive a subsidy. And only new AD plants will be eligible for the new scheme, but the old ones are all on the old renewable heat incentive. And then there's a third mechanism for renewable energy for transport fuels, which is called the Renewable Transport Fuel Obligation. And that's for biomethane or biodiesel, and might be extended a little bit in the UK. And the interesting thing about that is that electricity is now not the hardest to decarbonise part of energy in the UK, but transport fuels probably are. And there's a huge focus on aviation fuel as well, because it's a very hard to decarbonise sector, as well as heat. So more and more energy, more and more of the fuel from waste, I think, is going to go into aviation, possibly shipping as well as heavy transport, the rest of which is being electrified. And just to say that actually from renewables, biomass and biofuels were a huge source of renewable energy historically. So it's worth knowing that that's a way of funding your renewables. And that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take questions after.
Wonderful.
Bernard.
Excellent. Thank you, Deborah. And again, a reminder, please don't hesitate to ask any questions. We've seen some really good interaction going on in the Q&A already. So if you have any questions for any of the panelists, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A, and we'll stay on at the end of the presentation to allow for a little bit more discussion. So turning it over to our final presenter of today, Bernard Fenner of True North Renewable Energy. Pass it on to you, Bernard.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah, in my brief presentation, I tried to build kind of a bridge between Europe and US California where it's appropriate. And in my presentation, I will predominantly talk about AD and focus of the industrial high solids AD sector and not in general on AD. We have seen before also some wet AD or low solids AD examples. So basically, I'm going to go into the early developments, the market growth, maturation, my brief background, the policies that develop the AD, support development of AD facilities, the waste management systems and their impact, the pricing structure in US and Canada, and also from an organic material, the drivers and characteristics and conclusions and lessons learned. That might be helpful for California. So for over 40 years, AD technology development has been on the way in Europe for processing organic material, driven predominantly by issue of declining landfill space. There were actually 3 phases in that development that occurred during these 40 years. First of all, the European government funded the university and academic research to initiate anaerobic digestion technology developments or trials. Then you had pilot and demonstration scale facilities that have been developed in the 80s. And these developments then led to the commercialization phase that was launched in the 90s. You see here in that particular slide 3 technologies that have been introduced quite early. Valoga technology.
Yeah, we're not seeing your presentation. You might need to reshare it, reshare the screen.
Oh. Share screen. Share.
There we go.
Oh, okay. Sorry for that. So you just missed the introduction slide. So thanks, Erin, for that. So in that particular slide, you see these 3 technologies that have been early on the market: Valoga technology, OWS from Belgium, and Compogas from Switzerland, where I was active. Yeah, basically then after these first commercial facilities, there was I would say the big breakdown in Europe with the different technologies, as we have just seen before that, Valoga technology that went into Urbaser, Steinwil, Urbaser, Dranko, Compogas, and the Linde technology that was later on the Strabag technology. And you see how many facilities have been built during year 2000s. There was a huge growth in Central Europe, Germany, Switzerland, Netherlands, Spain, and also some in UK and Austria. So that was the big growth phase. And then later on in the 2010, I would say there was a maturation starting and a saturation in certain countries in Europe. So technology was evolved, was developed, especially in Germany, Switzerland, Netherlands. There was a saturation with the many plants that have been built. And you see that here in 2018, more than 18,000 biogas plants have been in operation. That's including the agricultural biogas facilities, which are kind of about 2/3 of the market share. In contrary, if you look at US, in 2018, there were just a bit more than 300 biogas plants online, either standalone or for farms. So the market development lags quite behind Europe, I would say almost 20 years. My background, I was starting in 2010. I was starting at Compogas. There we operated 16 facilities in Switzerland, so quite an operational experience. We have developed a lot of facilities during that time in Switzerland, and we have constructed internationally a lot of facilities all over Europe. And once we joined Hitachi Zosen Innova with the Compogas technology, we brought actually that brand global to Sweden, to China, to Greece, but also to US, where we developed and operated the first AD facility in San Luis Obispo. And now in my role since 2018 with True North, we are actively developing facilities that we then will also operate, large-scale facilities in southwestern US to help actually California to treat the organic waste that will come to the market. Now to the drivers. I think we have heard that before already quite a lot, what were the driving, but I think it's important to hear that again. I think if you compare also, that's the bridge I was talking, European countries and US states, you have different sizes, different population density. We have heard before, Wales, as a small kind of country or area of a country, you have different governments, different market structure and landfill fees, etc. But one decisive factor was the implementation of the EU landfill directive that established the goals to landfill diversion of 35% by 2020, which I think has been achieved. And in 2018, they even went further and with the restriction of prohibiting landfilling of several collected organic material. And with that landfill directive, most of the European countries at the same time established incentives to produce and feed renewable energy into the grid. First, it started with power, electricity. Also here in Switzerland, it has been subsidized quite strongly. But later on, in the last, I would say, 8 to 10 years, also renewable natural gas was supported, more and more supported. Just to give you a perspective, in 2019, the renewable energy sources in total made about 1/3 of the electricity consumption in the European Union, and which of there is about 8% from solid biofuels, where the organic waste is also part of it. Quite significant. Yeah, and if you look in that chart on the left, lower left side, if you look at this one, it's quite visible that in most of the countries, AD is the predominant biogas producer from all the different sources. It's thermal process, AD, sewage gas, or landfill gas. So in most cases, AD, in average 75% of the biogas produced in Europe is coming from AD, which is about 4% of the natural gas consumption in Europe, and in Germany it's even beyond that at 12%. And there is this organization, IEA Bioenergy Task 37, where there are different member countries. Unfortunately, the US is not one of the member countries, but in these countries, almost 600 biomethane facilities have been operational in 2019. I guess it's now even more. So in essence, there's two factors supporting the development and the operation of AD facilities in Europe. One is that landfill diversion regulation with the landfill fees, and we have heard that also before with the landfill tax. And the other one, at the same time, the incentives of producing renewable energy, renewable natural gas, electricity. These were the drivers. And that is also one of the difficulties we face in the AD sector. On one hand, you deal with the waste sector, where about 2/3 of the incoming is coming from the tip fee. On the other side, you deal with the energy sector, and in many cases, they are not well aligned. We see that also in California. What is the impact of the waste management system? So we have heard that before. We have well-established organic waste diversion goals in Europe for more than 20 years. But in addition, we have also, alongside with that, we have waste-to-energy facilities well-established all over Europe. Many of the European countries banned landfills completely and imposed landfill tax. We have heard that up to $133 in UK, which is really a driver to go to organics processing. But also it's the incentive of reusing, recycling, and recovering. So valorization of the organic waste or the waste as such has driven that initiative. And in 2018, the European Waste Directive has been further developed and updated towards minimization of that, of the waste, protection of the environment and human health. And that was again also support a driver to separate the organic waste and also recycle all the waste streams. And one that comes along with the energy incentives, I think, in contrary to US and especially California, Europe is an importer of fossil fuels. So we cannot just rely on natural gas and produce electricity from natural gas. We just import all fossil fuels. So any fuel or any energy that we can produce in a different way, like from waste to energy or from AD, as a valuable contribution to the energy generation in Europe. Now, looking at the waste disposal pricing in US, especially in California, the good news is that it has been increasing since 2017, especially in large landfills. The bad news, it's still on a quite low level. When we look at the Pacific area, the average today is at $72. But looking at California itself, it's only about at an average of $60 per ton, which is still low. So we have to face that low landfill tip fee, and we have to make the best out of that to produce a solution that is competitive with a landfill. Even though the SB1383 mandates to divert 75% of the organics from landfill, but at the moment there's, even though it's implemented and it's going to start next year, the program, it seems that the drivers are not as strong, and the enforcement seems also to be lacking in California. The good news on the other side, I would also say, is that there is landfill tip fees that are quite broad, and some are going up to $120 per ton. So in that sense, there is an opportunity here in California to also introduce that technology and these solutions to support that diversion goals. Now, what about the organic material drivers? Also comparing Europe to California, I think, and we have seen that before in the other presentation, actually this long history helps to better understand, participate, and further develop these processing and the established infrastructure. That was really nicely shown with these trucks, these separate collection trucks. We have a similar system in Switzerland. Now in California, the good news is also that there is a separate collection already in place for green organics, but so far very limited for food scraps. And there is certainly a hope with SB 1383 being implemented and hopefully enforced that this will grow. Another difference between Europe and California, I would say, is the seasons. In California, there's hardly any season. Whereas in California, it's quite consistent. And I would say also what is different at the moment, and this might change over the time, that in most European countries, only compost derived from AD from source-separate organic collection is allowed, with some exceptions like Spain and Portugal. We know that in California this is still allowed, but I can imagine that over time this will also become a problem, especially due to contamination. So if you look at these nice pictures down on this slide, the German bio-waste, the Italian bio-waste, the sewer waste, which is quite clean, and the organic waste in California, here that's a specific picture from the Bay Area, they look quite similar. So at the end of the day, the technology to treat that is going to be quite similar. And that leads me actually to my last slide and the conclusion. I think it's really a big opportunity for California to build on what Europe has gone through in the last 40 years. Proven models, proven technology, replicate that, implement that as fast as possible to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. I'm sure that if SB 1383 is enforced as it should be, then there will be a success factor for AD developments as we see and as we anticipate. And looking at the material characteristics, I'm quite hopeful that all these learnings from Europe can be implemented quite well in California. And with that, I'm at the end of the presentation. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Bernard. All right, wonderful. Well, thank you to all of our panelists. Again, for those of you who are still remaining with us, I definitely want to direct you to the Q&A function and some of the really good dialogue going on in there regarding use of the bin liners and the contamination. Kind of as we wrap this up, I think I want to throw just a general question out to the panelists, for our participants attending this webinar who are now in the beginning processes of implementing these programs that are resulting in a bit of a shift from the customers and looking at the presentations and really the participation happening at the source, i.e. the residents, the businesses, as well as a contamination level within those streams. What would be your advice to our recycling and solid waste managers here on the webinar who are in the early stages? I know, Andy, you had shown a few screenshots of some pretty robust media campaigns. I know Eric with the source separation, not just from the customer, but also your employees who are working at the truck. So any kind of high level advice that you have for our solid waste managers who are now implementing this pretty dramatic policy change?
I mean, you've really covered what I was just going to say, that getting the encouraging and householders to actually do the right thing and give them enough information and to get over the fear factor, the yuck factor that somebody mentioned in the chat bar there in the questions, and that actually it's a very secure way for food waste to be collected and not actually be attractive to rats or other vermin. And perhaps some demonstration videos or cartoons, is a really good way to get that message across, or actually highlight a typical resident who's doing it. Yep, actually go into the house and show how it's done, and that can be a very powerful message across to everybody.
Wonderful. No.
My advice would be think long term.
Mm-hmm.
At the moment, that's what we hear in California. Well, we don't see food waste. Think long term. This infrastructure is going to be in place long term. It needs to have commitment for these long-term solutions. We have heard that from Deborah. It's quite intensive, capital intensive. It's not built from today to tomorrow. So really think long term.
Wonderful. Great. How about you, Eric, as the operator there? What have you seen as most effective in customer change and cultural change?
I think from my point of view, I think the more that we can be really open with householders about and explain to them what actually happens to both their recyclables and their compost, and start framing things not just about what's of best environmental interest, but what's best for kind of economic resilience as well. So people can kind of understand where this stuff ends up and that they're actually doing the right thing. And that requires being really open about where things go. And I'm probably talking more about the dry recycling thing than I am about the composting thing, but I think the two kind of, we tend to have a culture, I think, of confidentiality, and I don't think confidentiality spreads to the materials and the composting materials that people put out themselves as parts of a publicly funded scheme.
Definitely. Wonderful. Thank you. Anything to add, Deborah?
Find the mute button. I guess part of that is about the communications, and both Andy and Eric have talked about the importance of leaflets and advertising campaigns and knocking on doors. And around the UK, the best local authorities have hired people to go and knock on doors and sit down and talk to householders, have a chat with them. Yes, I know it's difficult. You've got lots of kids, you've got nappies and lots of waste, and talk them through the process and then keep at it. And it's quite labour intensive and quite expensive to do that. But eventually, you save on the disposal costs. And that's really the lesson of all these approaches, is that the disposal costs are so high in the UK that if you can trim away at your landfill costs and your incineration costs, then and get some value back from clean recycling, then your quid's in. But you've really got to put that labour in, and it's not sort of glamorous kit. It's labour and people, and it's those sort of soft skills which perhaps are not valued so highly. It's not glitzy capital projects, it's just slog. And with Bryson being a social enterprise, they sort of excel at that community contact and communication.
Great. Well, thank you all for sharing part of your evenings with us over there in Europe, and for our participants and joining us this morning. We will be in touch soon about our next webinar series. And for those of you who did respond to our survey on content, we certainly have more coming, so stay tuned. And for our panelists, if any of you have any additional questions or outreach, certainly feel free to contact either myself, Erin at Diversion Strategies, or Kathy at admin at Diversion Strategies, or Rachel, who wasn't able to join us today. And we can help connect you with any one of our panelists today. Very, very interesting content and experience. And thank you all for your time. Thanks.
Thank you. A pleasure.